The Texarkana Phantom Killer, 1946, USA. February 22, 1946. The war had been over for 6 months. The boys were home. The world was supposed to be safe again. In Texarkana, couples were doing what couples do, finding dark, quiet roads at the edge of town, away from parents and noise and prying eyes. Jimmy Hollis, 25, and Mary Jean Larry, 19, had parked on a lover's lane just north of town. It was late. It was quiet. That was the point. Then a figure stepped out of the dark. He wore a white mask over his face, crude, homemade, with holes cut for the eyes. He carried a flashlight in one hand and something heavier in the other. He ordered them out of the car. What happened next was savage and clinical at the same time. He beat Jimmy Hollis with a blunt object, fracturing his skull, then turned to Mary Jean. She was assaulted in ways the 1946 press could only hint at in careful, euphemistic language. When he was done, he left them both alive on the road and walked back into the darkness. They survived. They were the lucky ones, the only ones. A month passed. The town whispered about the attack but settled back into its routines. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe the man was gone. March came and went. Easter Sunday, March 24, 1946, fell on a cool, clear night, and Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17, made the same mistake that Jimmy and Mary Jean had made. They parked on a quiet road outside of town. They were found the next morning, both shot in the back of the head, execution style. Polly had been moved after death. The blood patterns made that clear, though investigators never publicly explained what exactly had been done to her before she died. The Texarkana Gazette published the story in careful terms. The police had very little to go on. The killer had left almost nothing. 3 weeks later, he came back, April 14, 1946. Virgil Starks, who was not yet a victim but would be, was somewhere in town that night while Paul Martin, 17, and Betty Jo Booker, 15, played a gig with her jazz band at a VFW dance in Texarkana. Betty Jo was a saxophonist. Paul was her ride home. They left the dance together sometime after midnight. Their car was found the next morning on a rural road, empty, keys still in the ignition. Paul Martin's body turned up first, shot multiple times, found on the road as though he'd been running. Betty Jo Booker was found 6 miles away, in the woods, shot in the face and the chest. She had her saxophone with her when she left the dance. It was never found. Some details from crime scenes linger because they're grotesque. That one lingers because it's simply sad. A 15-year-old girl, a Friday night, a music gig, and then nothing but woods and silence. Now the town broke. The Texas Rangers rode in. The FBI sent agents down from Washington. Local police, county sheriffs, state investigators from both Arkansas and Texas, all of them descended on Texarkana at once. Roadblocks went up on every road out of town. The Gazette ran the story on the front page with a skull and crossbones. The headline reading, "Phantom Killer Strikes Again." Hardware stores sold out of guns and deadbolts within days. Movie theaters closed early. Drive-ins shut down entirely. No one wanted to sit in a parked car in the dark anymore. People who lived alone slept with neighbors. Couples who had been meeting in secret suddenly stopped meeting at all. Investigators worked every angle they had. They interviewed hundreds of people. They collected tire tracks, footprints, spent shell casings. They developed a profile, a local man, probably white, probably familiar with the roads and the patrol patterns. Someone who knew which nights the deputies changed shifts. Someone who lived in or near Texarkana. Someone who might have been standing next to you at the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. They had suspects, several over the years. One named Ewell Swinney came up repeatedly, a small-time car thief whose wife gave investigators a statement suggesting he had confessed to the murders. But she later recanted, or gave conflicting accounts, and without physical evidence, there was nothing to charge him with. Swinney was eventually imprisoned for car theft under habitual offender laws and died in 1994, never charged, never conclusively cleared. Other names surfaced and faded. The case stayed open. Then, on May 3, 1946, the Phantom did something different. Virgil Starks, 36, was a farmer who lived outside of town, about 10 miles from the Arkansas state line. That night, he was sitting in his living room armchair, reading the newspaper headlines, still full of the Phantom murders, while his wife Katie was in the bedroom. At 9 p.m., a rifle bullet came through the window and hit him in the back of the head. Before Katie could fully understand what had happened, a second bullet came through and hit Virgil again. Katie Starks ran. She made it to the front door, and the killer shot her through a window as she fled the bullet, taking off part of her upper lip and nose. She kept running, barefoot across the gravel, to a neighbor's house a quarter-mile away. She survived. The killer searched the Starks' house, investigators found evidence of it, and then left. It was his last confirmed attack. After May 3, 1946, the Phantom Killer of Texarkana was never heard from again. No arrest, no confession, no deathbed admission, no letter to the police, nothing. The Rangers stayed for weeks. The FBI worked the case for months. Suspects came and went. In 1946, forensic science was still in an early age. There was no DNA analysis, no computerized databases, no reliable way to link evidence across scenes in the ways investigators can today. What they had were shell casings, a few partial footprints, and the accounts of 2 survivors who had seen a man in a white mask in the dark. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Over the decades, true crime writers and amateur investigators have returned to the case again and again. In 1976, a film called The Town That Dreaded Sundown dramatized the murders and became a cult classic. Part horror movie, part local legend, Texarkana leaned into the story the way only a town with no resolution can, not proudly but helplessly, the way you acknowledge a scar. The Phantom became folklore. He became a campfire story. He became the thing parents used to warn teenagers about parking on dark roads. But for the people who lived through those 10 weeks in 1946, it wasn't folklore. It was 10 weeks of not knowing whether the man sitting next to you at the diner was the person who had executed 4 people in the dark. It was loading a gun before bed every night. It was the knowledge that something had come and killed and simply walked back into the shadows as if the rules of justice didn't apply to it. 61-year-old Katie Starks, the last surviving victim, went to her grave without ever knowing who shot her through her own living room window. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, the ones who lived through the very first attack, carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in the red clay hills between Texas and Arkansas, the answer to all of it remained buried. The file is still open, the Phantom is still unnamed. And if you drive through Texarkana on a quiet night and pull off onto one of those old rural roads, the ones that look the same now as they did in 1946, you'll understand why people still lock their doors a little tighter there than anywhere else. Not because of ghosts, not because of legend, because of the thing that is somehow worse than a ghost, the thing that was real and was never caught. The Amber Hagerman case, 1996, USA. You know the Amber Alert. You've heard it. That jarring, electronic tone cutting through the radio, the text message that lights up your phone at 2 a.m., the highway sign that suddenly flashes a license plate number and a name. In the United States alone, the system has helped recover over 1,000 children. It is one of the most effective child safety tools ever created. It was named after a 9-year-old girl who was never found alive, and the man who took her was never caught. This is the story of Amber Hagerman, and it begins on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in a quiet neighborhood in Arlington, Texas. The kind of afternoon that feels so safe, so suburban, so completely unremarkable, that no one thought anything could go wrong. January 13th, 1996. It was a cool winter day, the kind of mild Texas winter that still lets kids play outside. Amber Hagerman was 9 years old, bright-eyed, energetic, the kind of child people remember vividly even years later. She had a little brother named Ricky, who was 5. That afternoon, their grandfather, Jimmy Whitson had taken them to ride their bikes in an abandoned Winn-Dixie parking lot near his home on Abner Lane in Arlington. It was a familiar place, close to home, the kind of spot kids had been playing in for years without incident. At some point, Jimmy went back inside. Amber and Ricky kept riding. What happened in the next few minutes would change everything. A neighbor named Jim Keevil was outside when he heard it, a little girl screaming. He looked up and saw a man in a dark pickup truck reach out, grab Amber Hagerman off her bicycle, and pull her into the vehicle. Ricky was still there, on his bike, watching the truck sped away. Keevil called 911 immediately. Ricky rode to his grandfather's house and told him what he'd seen. By the time police arrived at the parking lot, the truck was gone. Amber was gone. It had taken less than 60 seconds. The Arlington Police Department launched an immediate search. The description was maddeningly vague: a dark-colored pickup truck, possibly black or dark blue, an older model. The driver described as a white male, possibly in his 20s or 30s. No license plate, no clear look at the man's face. Jim Keevil had seen enough to know something terrible was happening, but not enough to give investigators a thread to pull. What followed was the kind of search that parents have nightmares about. Hundreds of volunteers combed through Arlington. Flyers went up across the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex overnight. Amber's face, dark hair, bright smile was everywhere within hours. Police worked the phones, followed every lead, canvassed the neighborhood door to door. Her parents, Donna Williams and Richard Hagerman, went on TV and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The calls came in, hundreds of them. None of them led anywhere solid. 4 days passed. On January 17, 1996, 4 days after Amber disappeared, a man walking his dog in a drainage ditch near Amber's neighborhood made the discovery that everyone had been dreading. Amber Hagerman's body was found in a creek bed in a residential area, not far from where she had been taken. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut. The medical examiner estimated she had been killed within the first 24 to 48 hours of her abduction, meaning she was likely already dead by the time the search was at its most frantic. She was 9 years old. The grief that hit Arlington, that hit the entire country, was the kind that doesn't leave clean. There is something uniquely devastating about the murder of a child in broad daylight, in a familiar neighborhood, while her 5-year-old brother watched from a few feet away. It wasn't a stranger in the shadows of a dark alley. It happened in a parking lot, on a Saturday afternoon, in a neighborhood where people knew each other. Investigators worked the case intensely. The FBI came in. Tips poured in from across the country. Detectives followed up on every registered sex offender in the area, every lead that came in from the public hotline, every dark pickup truck reported by neighbors. They had physical evidence from the crime scene, the medical examiner's findings, trace evidence recovered from where Amber's body was found, but without a suspect to match it to. It sat in evidence lockers going nowhere. The man in the dark truck had simply disappeared. In the weeks after Amber's murder, a woman named Diana Simone was listening to the radio in the Dallas area when it hit her why she thought. Couldn't radio stations interrupt regular programming to broadcast descriptions of missing children, the same way they broadcast weather emergencies? She started making calls. Other parents and advocates in the area were thinking along the same lines. The idea found its way to local broadcasters and then to law enforcement. Within months of Amber's murder, the first local Amber Alert system was operational in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The acronym was made to fit the name America's Missing, Broadcast Emergency Response. Over the following years, the system spread state by state across the country. In 2003, President George W. Bush signed the Amber Alert into federal law, making it a nationwide network. Today, it operates across all 50 states and has expanded internationally to over 30 countries. Every single time that alert fires, every time your phone shakes with that unmistakable tone, it exists because of what happened to a 9-year-old girl in Arlington, Texas on a Saturday in January. But Amber herself never got justice. The case has never been solved. Over the years, several suspects have been investigated. Investigators have periodically announced that they were pursuing new leads, that advances in DNA technology were being applied to the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. In 2020, the Arlington Police Department announced they had developed a DNA profile of the suspect from evidence preserved since 1996, a significant development in forensic terms, meaning that if the killer is ever identified, there is biological evidence to confirm it. But as of today, no arrest has ever been made. The man who grabbed Amber Hagerman off her bicycle in 60 seconds, who killed her within a day or two, and who drove away in a dark pickup truck, he has never been named. He was never pulled over at a roadblock, never turned in by someone who recognized the description, never caught by the net that thousands of investigators and volunteers cast across the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the days after her disappearance. He moved through the world after January 13, 1996, and the world let him. What remains is the legacy that was built from the grief, the orange highway signs, the wireless emergency alerts, the system that has now saved over 1,000 children who got to grow up because someone heard a broadcast and spotted a car, or a face, or a plate number in time. It is a remarkable thing that came from an unbearable thing. Donna Williams, Amber's mother, has spent decades advocating for child safety. She has attended the signings of legislation, spoken at memorials, watched the system named after her daughter spread across the world. She has done this while carrying something that no parent should ever have to carry: the knowledge of what happened to her child and the silence where an answer should be. Amber Hagerman would be in her late 30s today. She never got to be. She was 9 years old, riding her bike on a Saturday afternoon in a neighborhood where she'd ridden 100 times before. And then a truck pulled up and a door opened, and in less than a minute, she was gone. The alert that bears her name fires somewhere in this country almost every day. The man who made it necessary was never found. Torso in the Thames, Adam, 2001, England. This is the story of the boy in the river. And it begins on a Tuesday morning in September, in the heart of London, September 21st, 2001. 10 days after the world was still reeling from the attacks in New York, a boy's torso was pulled from the River Thames near Tower Bridge. Just a torso, no head, no arms, no legs. The limbs had been removed with what forensic examiners would later describe as clean, deliberate cuts. Not the work of a propeller or river debris, not the chaos of an accident. The cuts were surgical in their precision. Whoever had done this had done it carefully and with purpose. The boy was estimated to be between 4 and 7 years old. He was wearing a single item of clothing, a pair of bright orange shorts, size 2 to 3, made by a German manufacturer. That was it. No shoes, no shirt, no identifying marks beyond his own body. Scotland Yard assigned the case to Detective Inspector Will O'Reilly and a team that would eventually grow to involve dozens of investigators across multiple countries. From the very first day, they understood they were looking at something deeply unusual. The dismemberment was not the work of someone trying clumsily to hide a body. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, too anatomically specific. The head and limbs had been removed, but the torso, the trunk of the body, had been kept intact. In forensic terms, that detail was a signal. Someone had wanted the torso preserved, but preserved for what purpose? And why? The forensic work that followed was some of the most painstaking in British criminal history. Because Adam had no face, no fingerprints, no dental records on file anywhere. The traditional tools of identification were useless. What investigators had was the body itself, and they were going to have to read it like a text. The first major breakthrough came from the bone analysis. By examining the mineral composition of Adam's bones and the strontium isotope ratios in his teeth, a technique that essentially maps where in the world a person grew up based on the soil and water they consumed, forensic scientists were able to determine that Adam had not grown up in England. He had grown up in West Africa. More specifically, the isotope evidence pointed to a region in Nigeria, likely around the Benin City area in Edo State. The contents of Adam's stomach told another story entirely. When pathologists examined what was inside him, they found pollen grains from plants native to the German Rhine Valley. They found particles consistent with a specific type of clay found in Central Europe. What this suggested was disturbing in a particular way. Adam had been in continental Europe, likely Germany or a neighboring country, Shortly before he died, he had been moved, trafficked almost certainly, from West Africa to Europe, and then to London, where he ended up in the Thames. He was somewhere between 4 and 7 years old, and he had already been transported across at least 2 continents before someone killed him. The orange shorts provided a thread. They were traced to a batch manufactured in Germany and sold through a specific retail chain. This was consistent with the European pollen evidence in his stomach. The shorts were a German brand, sold in Germany, and a small boy from Nigeria had been wearing them when he died in London. Investigators now had a rough geography of Adam's final months, but they still had no name, no family, no perpetrator. They turned to the African diaspora community in London, distributing information and appealing for help. They contacted Nigerian authorities and Interpol. They sent investigators to Nigeria to work with local police and try to trace the origin of the child. The investigation led detectives deep into a world they had been, in some ways, unprepared for. What emerged, piece by piece, was the suspicion, and eventually the near certainty among investigators that Adam had been killed as part of a ritual murder. The term used in West African cultural contexts is muti, though investigators also used the broader term ritual killing. The practice involves the use of human body parts, particularly those of children, in traditional medicine or ritual ceremonies, in the belief that the parts carry spiritual power that can bring wealth protection or good fortune to those who commission or conduct the ritual. The deliberate, anatomically precise removal of the limbs. The preserved torso. The fact that Adam had apparently been brought specifically to London, a city with a large Nigerian diaspora community and significant underground economy, before being killed, all of it pointed in one direction. Scotland Yard detectives consulting with cultural experts and law enforcement officials in Nigeria and South Africa came to believe that Adam had been trafficked for the specific purpose of being used in a ritual killing, and that his body parts had been retained by whoever performed the ritual while the torso was disposed of in the Thames. That conclusion was not reached lightly. It was controversial, and it still is. Some researchers and cultural advocates pushed back on the characterization, warning against the sensationalizing of African spiritual practices or the creation of a moral panic. Investigators acknowledged the sensitivity. But the forensic evidence, the pattern of cuts, the specific preservation of the torso, the removal of the extremities and head, did not match any other explanation they could construct. Adam, they concluded, had been brought to England to die. In the years following, detectives pursued multiple leads and suspects. A woman named Joyce Osagiede, a Nigerian national who had lived in Germany, was identified as a person of interest. She had purchased orange shorts of the same type in Germany, around the time Adam was believed to have been in Europe. She was questioned multiple times over the years, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and in Ireland, where she was living at one point. She denied knowledge of Adam. She was never charged. The investigation reached into Germany, into Ireland, into Nigeria itself, following the trail of a child trafficking network that investigators believed had been operating for years, bringing children from rural Nigerian communities into Europe under the cover of false promises to their families, promises of education, of a better life of opportunity. Instead, the children disappeared into a shadow world. Scotland Yard worked with Nigerian authorities to conduct DNA outreach in Nigeria, testing hundreds of families in Edo State who had lost or were missing children. In 2019, investigators announced a major development through a combination of DNA genealogy and isotope analysis. They believed they had identified the specific area in Nigeria, a village in Edo State, from which Adam had come. They were closer than they had ever been to putting a name to the boy. As of the time of writing, Adam has never been formally identified. No one has been charged with his murder. His name, the name investigators gave him, remains the only name he has. But the case of Adam changed British law enforcement permanently. It forced the creation of new specialist units dedicated to investigating child trafficking and ritual crime. It brought the reality of muti killings onto the radar of European law enforcement in a way they could no longer ignore. It produced new protocols for identifying trafficked children, The forensic techniques developed to trace Adam's origins, the isotope analysis, the pollen study, the bone mapping, have since been used in dozens of investigations across the world. What the case could not produce was justice. Somewhere, the people who took a small boy from a village in Nigeria, carried him across the ocean, transported him through Europe, and brought him to London to kill him. Those people are still alive. They walked away. They may have gone on to traffic other children. They may have done this again, and the boy in the orange shorts remains unnamed, resting in a grave in a London cemetery under a headstone that reads simply, Adam. He was between 4 and 7 years old. He had crossed the world by the time he died. He had done nothing to deserve any of it, and the world, for all its surveillance cameras and forensic laboratories and international task forces, could not save him, could not name him, and could not find the people who took his life. The Thames still runs through London every day, cold and indifferent, past Tower Bridge, past the spot where a child was found floating in orange shorts on a September morning while the rest of the world was looking at the sky. He deserved a name. He deserved to go home. He got neither.